What would you do with 14 freezing soldiers? January 1945, Alsace, France. 14 bedrolls sat against a locked chapel door. Snow buried the road outside the village in less than 3 hours. The temperature dropped below 11 degrees before midnight. The wind pushed through broken window seams inside the replacement barracks. 2 coal stoves failed before evening chow. The chapel still had heat, and 60 empty seats. The lock had been placed there by an American chaplain, not the Germans. The snow kept falling. Michael Levin, Atlanta, 24. He'd been an assistant chaplain clerk for 7 months. He'd seen broken pews, flooded tents, and prayer books burned for warmth. But he'd never seen soldiers refused shelter beside a church. The 14 men had arrived that afternoon with replacement papers folded inside wet field jackets. Most had crossed from Marseille through 3 staging depots in 9 days. 4 had already spent 2 nights sleeping inside railway stations after transport delays near Dijon. Now they stood outside another door, a chapel door. Levin carried the scheduling clipboard himself. Sunday Protestant services were listed at 0900. Catholic services at 1300. Maintenance heating restrictions had been issued the week before after fuel shortages cut coal deliveries by 40% across several Third Army support sectors. The rule was simple: no overnight occupancy, especially not inside designated worship spaces. One soldier asked if they could at least sleep near the stove until morning. The answer stayed no. Snow collected on the bedrolls beside the entrance. One blanket froze stiff against the stone wall before midnight. A corporal from Cleveland tried moving the men into an empty supply shed 200 yards away, but the roof had partially collapsed under snow the week before. So the men stayed outside. 14 bedrolls. 1 locked chapel. Nobody raised their voice. Levin watched one of the soldiers scrape ice from his bootlaces using a mess knife. Another wrapped his hands with torn cloth from a laundry sack. A third man sat against the wall reading a Hebrew prayer book beneath a flashlight with fading batteries. The chapel windows glowed yellow behind them. The stove inside still burned. Rain hit the canvas. At 22:10 hours, another officer arrived and asked why the men had not been moved into the building temporarily. The chaplain pointed to the written order attached beside the lock. Religious scheduling spaces were not to be used as emergency barracks without sector authorization. The order carried a valid signature, and technically, the chaplain was right. The building had been preserved for worship during some of the worst winter fighting in France. Earlier that month, 3 nearby churches had been damaged after troops slept inside without supervision. One altar fire had nearly destroyed an entire village chapel near Colmar. The rule existed for a reason, but 14 soldiers were still outside. One of them began coughing blood into the snow shortly after midnight. That was when somebody finally sent word upward. Not through command, through the chaplain network. The message reached Third Army headquarters the next morning, beside routine weather reports and supply summaries. Most officers ignored it after reading the first sentence. One did not. George Patton stopped at the second line. 14 Jewish replacements denied heated shelter. He read the report twice. Then he asked one question. Who locked the door? This is what Patton said. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the stories about World War II that expose the moment regulations collided with human beings. The Jeep engine started before sunrise. January 1945. Third Army Winter Sector. Fuel restrictions had already reached 23 support sites across Alsace. Coal mattered more than comfort by then. Entire convoys froze on secondary roads after the Ardennes offensive redirected transport priorities north toward Bastogne. One engineering report from January 11th listed 47 disabled trucks abandoned beside frozen roads near Saverne after fuel drums failed to arrive on schedule. The shortages were real. So were the rules. The chapel had 60 heated seats inside. 14 soldiers slept outside. 2 sentences apart. Nobody needed commentary. The replacement group had arrived from a processing station near Marseille carrying reassignment orders stamped for infantry, support companies rebuilding after December losses. Some units inside Third Army had lost nearly 31% of rifle strength during the winter fighting. Replacement depots pushed men forward almost immediately after arrival. Names first. Sleep later. The chapel itself had become unusually important during the winter. Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish services rotated through the same building because artillery damage had destroyed 3 nearby civilian churches during November shelling near the German border. That created friction. Not hatred, friction. The Army scheduling order tried to solve it by assigning exact hours to each denomination. Heating fuel could not support constant use, so the building stayed locked outside approved service windows, unless emergency authorization came through divisional command. That was the system, and systems protect themselves. Michael Levin carried copies of the schedule in his satchel beside casualty forms and burial notices. The paper itself had started softening from snow exposure around the edges. He later remembered the lock more clearly than the storm. A brass civilian lock, not military issue. The tent stayed silent. Levin had tried once already to bend the rule before the replacements arrived. Earlier that week, 9 Catholic soldiers slept inside during a freezing rainstorm after their transport trucks broke down outside Hagenau. No complaint followed because the senior chaplain approved it verbally afterward. This time was different. The ranking Protestant chaplain insisted the Jewish replacements wait for authorization through official channels first. Temporary exceptions had already caused 2 written disputes during December. One officer accused another denomination of receiving preferential treatment inside shared facilities. Nobody wanted another complaint, especially not during wartime. That mattered to the chaplain. He was not written as a villain inside the records later discussed among staff officers. He had protected damaged churches for months during retreat and counterattack conditions. He personally organized burial services after 2 ambulance units were destroyed near Strasbourg in November. Several enlisted men later defended him openly, which made the situation harder, not easier. Because reasonable men sometimes create unreasonable outcomes by following correct procedures too literally. That was the real problem. The search phrase appeared often years later in veterans' discussions. Jewish soldiers, WWII. Not because of combat, because of accommodation. Jewish American soldiers frequently struggled finding formal worship support inside rapidly moving European operations. Some units lacked rabbis entirely. Others borrowed shared facilities from Protestant or Catholic chaplains under rotating schedules that worked during normal conditions. This was not normal. The blizzard intensified around 2,300 hours. Wind speeds reportedly reached nearly 40 miles per hour along exposed village roads. Medical reports later estimated at least 3 of the replacement soldiers suffered mild exposure symptoms before dawn. One man lost feeling in 2 fingers. Another coughed blood into snow beside the chapel wall. Still, nobody broke the lock. That mattered later. Nobody forced the door. Nobody threatened the chaplain. The men stayed outside because they were soldiers, and soldiers followed orders. Rain turned to ice before morning. At Third Army headquarters, Patton finished reading the overnight incident summary beside breakfast coffee and weather maps. The report itself occupied less than half a page. Most of it concerned fuel allocation rules and interfaith scheduling procedures. Patton ignored almost all of that. He stopped at one sentence. 14 replacements remained outside overnight, pending authorization. He folded the paper once, then laid it flat again. Nobody in the room spoke. Patton looked toward the operations window. Snow covered nearly every vehicle parked outside headquarters. One driver later remembered Patton standing motionless for several seconds beside the desk, before asking where the chapel was located. Not who wrote the order, where. The jeep left 14 minutes later. The road north stayed covered in ice. The headquarters jeep carried chains on all 4 tires. Even then, the road nearly disappeared twice beneath drifting snow between Saverne and the village sector. One military police truck had already slid into a ditch before dawn. Engineers marked the roadside with white tape tied to frozen fence posts so convoy drivers could still follow the route through the storm. Patton sat in the rear seat wearing a winter field coat over riding boots darkened by slush, 4 stars on the helmet, ivory-handled revolvers at the belt. 1 sentence each. Nothing theatrical. A driver later remembered Patton speaking only twice during the trip. Once to ask how long the replacements had remained outside. Once to ask whether the chapel stove still had fuel inside. The answer was yes. That seemed to matter more. The village itself had once held nearly 100 civilians before the fighting crossed Alsace during late 1944. By January, fewer than 300 remained. Several houses stood empty after artillery damage forced evacuations earlier in the winter. Snow pushed through shattered roof beams near the central square. The chapel survived mostly intact. That was part of the tension. An intact, heated building surrounded by damaged, frozen barracks. The jeep stopped 40 yards from the entrance shortly after 0810 hours. No sirens, no shouting. Patton stepped into snow nearly halfway to his knees near the roadside ditch. 2 replacement soldiers were already awake outside the chapel wall, rolling stiff blankets into tight bedrolls before morning inspection. One of them still wore frozen cloth wrapped around both hands. Neither man recognized Patton immediately. The wind covered the sound of approaching boots. Michael Levin saw him first. Levin later remembered the revolvers before the face. Then the helmet stars. Then the silence spreading through the courtyard as officers realized who had arrived without warning. Nobody saluted correctly at first. The storm drowned half the commands. The chapel door remained locked. Patton stopped beside the stacked bedrolls without speaking. Snow covered part of one blanket almost completely. Another still showed a dark, frozen stain where somebody had coughed blood during the night. Patton looked at the lock for several seconds. Then at the windows. Heat still fogged the glass from inside. Nobody moved. The ranking chaplain arrived from the rear quarters carrying the scheduling binder beneath one arm. He began explaining before reaching the steps. Fuel restrictions, shared use disputes, standing authorization rules, preservation of worship spaces during combat operations. All true. Every part technically true. Patton listened without interrupting. That made several officers more nervous. The chaplain eventually pointed toward the posted order beside the entrance and explained that no denomination could receive special overnight access without formal approval because the policy existed specifically to prevent accusations of unequal treatment between religious groups. Again, reasonable logic. Patton looked at the paper, then at the bedrolls, then back toward the men. One replacement soldier stood coughing beside the wall while steam rose from wet gloves held near his mouth. Nobody spoke. The snow kept falling. Patton climbed the chapel steps slowly enough that everyone behind him stopped moving too. He touched the lock once with a gloved hand. Then he turned toward the chaplain. His voice stayed flat. Too flat. "Did you hold service in there yesterday?" The chaplain answered yes. Patton nodded once. Another physical beat. A medic crossed the courtyard carrying hot coffee towards the replacement group. One cup spilled into snow after his gloves slipped against the metal container. Nobody bent down to clean it. Patton looked past the chaplain towards the glowing windows behind the locked door. Then he spoke one sentence. "God doesn't freeze men outside." Nobody answered him. The wind carried snow across the chapel steps. One replacement soldier lowered his eyes towards the ground. Another stopped rolling his blanket halfway through the motion and simply stood there, holding it against his chest. Patton did not repeat himself. He never needed to. The ranking chaplain removed the lock key from his coat pocket almost immediately. His hands shook once while fitting it into the brass cylinder, not from fear, from cold. The lock opened. No applause followed. No speech. The door swung inward beside 14 wet bedrolls stacked against the wall. Heat moved into the courtyard immediately. The tent stayed silent. The soldiers entered quietly. That mattered. No cheering. No celebration. No insults thrown toward the chaplain standing beside the doorway. The men carried their own blankets inside and placed them carefully between pew rows, already moved apart for winter overflow seating. One soldier removed snow from his boots before stepping across the chapel floor. Another stopped beside the entrance and looked back once towards the chaplain before going inside. Nobody mocked him. The stove near the front pews still burned with enough coal for another 6 hours. Steam rose from soaked gloves hanging near the heat vents within minutes. A medic examined the soldier coughing blood beside the wall and moved him toward the warmest section near the altar rail. The building smelled like wet wool and melted snow. Michael Levin helped carry 14 bedrolls between the pews while another clerk brought 2 urns of coffee from the kitchen tent across the square. By 0900 hours. The entire replacement group sat inside the chapel wrapped in blankets beneath stained glass, darkened by the storm outside. 60 heated seats. 14 exhausted men. The contrast no longer needed explanation. Patton remained near the doorway most of the time. He did not deliver a lecture about tolerance. He did not demand punishment. Several officers later admitted they expected an explosion once he arrived. Instead, they watched something colder, restraint. The ranking chaplain stood beside the open door, holding the removed brass lock in one hand. Patton eventually walked toward him, without raising his voice. Another physical beat. Snow fell from Patton's gloves onto the wooden floor between them. One driver standing near the entrance later recalled that nobody inside the chapel even pretended to move during the exchange. Patton spoke first. "You protected the building." The chaplain answered yes. Patton nodded once. Then came the second sentence. "You forgot what it was for." That was all. No humiliation. No public destruction. The chaplain looked toward the soldiers warming themselves beside the pews. One replacement private had already fallen asleep, sitting upright against the wall, with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup. The silence lasted several seconds longer than anyone expected. Then Patton handed the brass lock back to him. That detail survived. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. Correction with dignity. Exactly once. The jeep driver later said Patton spent less than 11 minutes inside the chapel after the door opened, before leaving. He ordered one administrative change through the local command office. During severe weather exposure conditions, shared worship facilities could be used temporarily as emergency shelter without prior sector authorization. The order spread quickly. Within 48 hours, 7 additional chapels and 3 damaged schoolhouses across the region were added to emergency shelter lists for replacement troops moving through the winter lines. No disciplinary action followed. The original lock order disappeared from local records by the next morning. That disappeared too. Patton walked back through the snow without looking behind him. One replacement soldier attempted to thank him near the jeep. Patton stopped only long enough to answer with a single sentence. "You already earned the heat." Then he climbed into the vehicle. The engine started immediately. The storm ended late the next afternoon. By then, the story had already spread farther than the official order itself. Chaplain assistants repeated it first, then replacement clerks, then transport drivers moving between Third Army sectors. Within days, several officers began referring to the incident simply as the locked chapel. No formal report survived in standard disciplinary files, but the memory did. Attendance inside the chapel doubled the following Sunday. Not only Jewish soldiers, everyone. Protestants, Catholics, replacements waiting for transport north, mechanics from nearby motor pools, 2 nurses attached to a field hospital outside Severn. More than 120 men crowded into a room built for 60 seats. Some stood outside listening through the open doors. The ranking chaplain still led the service. That mattered too. Patton never removed him, because the point was not destruction. The point was correction. Several months later, one of the replacement soldiers reportedly wrote home describing the night beside the locked chapel wall. He mentioned frozen blankets, wet boots, the smell of coal heat after the doors opened. He never described Patton as heroic in the letter, only present years later. Discussions about Jewish American soldiers in World War II often focused on combat records, liberation units, or casualty totals, but smaller moments survived longer inside veterans' memories: shelter, food, worship space, whether someone was treated like they belonged. That was the deeper argument underneath the snowstorm. The chaplain defended order. Patton defended purpose, and both men believed they were protecting something sacred. Today, if you visit villages across the Alsace region during winter, many of the surviving churches still operate as shared community shelters during storms and emergency conditions. The doors stay open longer now than they once did in January 1945, maybe because people remembered. Or maybe because someone finally asked the simplest question first. What good is a chapel if freezing soldiers cannot enter it? The jeep tracks disappeared beneath snow before noon that morning, but the sentence stayed. God doesn't freeze men outside. Would you have protected the chapel rules or opened the doors like Patton did?